Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our guest tonight, Anna Neimark. So I'm just going to give Anna a brief introduction and then turn it over to her. So Anna has a BA in architecture from Princeton, an M.Arch from the GSD, and she is faculty at the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles, SCI-Arc. She is the principal of First Office, which she founded with Andrew Atwood in 2011. First Office has exhibited work at the Chicago Architecture Biennale, the Mack Center for Art and Architecture, and the Oslo Architecture Triennale. And very recently, Anna had a show at the SCI-Arc Gallery in Los Angeles called Rude Forms Among Us. I love that title. And that is an exhibition relating to her work on megalithic monuments. And I imagine she might talk a little bit about that tonight. Very exciting. And also, in addition to exhibiting, First Office has also received numerous honors, including the Architectural League Prize, the Architects Newspaper Best of Young Architects Award, and they were a finalist at MoMA PS1's Young Architect Program. In addition to these honors and exhibitions and teaching, Anna is widely published in journals such as Log and Perspecta and numerous others. So we're really excited to have you here tonight, Anna. I got to know Anna a little bit when I was doing a little bit of teaching in SCI-Arc, and I very much enjoyed sitting on reviews with Anna. I think she's a very fine teacher. There were some of her students' thesis projects that have been especially memorable to me. I know I'm teaching the kind of research phase of our thesis cohort this year, Anna, and I've shared with them a few projects of your students. So that's been really helpful to them. Yeah, and you were also supposed to be here last spring, and like more or less, I mean, you were going to come here in person, and very close to when the pandemic really took off, so to speak, was right around when you were supposed to come. So naturally, we had to cancel that. But better late than never. It's so awesome to see you here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, Matthew. It is great to be here. So thank you for having me. And thanks for the lovely introduction. It's really good that we have a chance to see each other even during these times. So I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for tuning in, and to Emma for setting up the webinar. And I look forward to it. I look forward to all of your questions at the end as well. So I hope that those of you who are watching can type things into Q&A and kind of enter the Zoom room at the end. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And what I would like to do today is share with you 3 projects from First Office. So all of the work that I'll show is a collaboration with Andrew Atwood and the office. And it's important that I kind of like describe this as a collaboration. It's been now one that has lasted 10 years, which is kind of amazing, because we always joke about the name of the firm, that it was not meant to be the last office. It was only meant to be the first. So we'll see how many more years we have in this kind of discussion. But we're somewhere, I think, in a place where we're moving out of work that is really purely academic and somewhat conceptual, and we're trying to move back into the field. And I'll kind of try to explain this a little bit toward the end of the presentation, why I'm using these terms. I think we're expanding and really trying to be conscious about the idea of working with clients and working in an environment that has a context. But all of that is new to us. And I think that is somewhat present in our minds right now, because the world out there is really important and kind of pressuring the work quite a bit to exit the gallery, to exit a kind of academic realm and to enter into something different, a kind of new phase. Nonetheless, I'm kind of looking at this with an eye backward, and the title of today's talk is called Filling in Blank Forms. And what I'll do is I'll read a couple of pages of text just to relax a little bit, because these events always make me a little bit nervous. And then I'll just jump into the project and talk through them. So bear with me for a moment. To define what I mean by blank forms, we have to return to that design quarterly issue number 7879 that was put together by John Margolis. In his letter to participants, Margolis outlined clearly that he was not interested in the traditional magazine format of ordered text and pictures. Rather, he wrote that he was looking for a more general and less specific type of communication. We all know that this more general and less specific type of communication became for Peter Eisenman the blank essay titled Notes on Conceptual Architecture. And here we see the title, the footnotes floating on empty pages, the references at the bottom of each page. The author, as the bio suggests, is Peter Eisenman, but his voice is not explicitly present other than for the formalities of the bio at the end of the essay. His authorship is defined by formatting a collection of other references, or by writing a biography of word text that could be. The conceptual act of writing is therefore historical. And this I get from Mark Jarzembek, who has written a bit about this act, a kind of Arbeit ohne Opus, as a kind of quotation from him. To the artists in this room, all of this self-redaction and the publication of seemingly nothing may appear nearly ordinary in 1970. By that time, everyone was familiar with Robert Rauschenberg's erased Koning drawing from 1953, Jean Cocteau's depiction of the blank poetry book titled Nudisme in his film Orpheus from 1949, John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence composed in 1952. Perhaps what made this particular submission so radical was that it came from a discipline that was rather conservative and quite professional, which is to say, it is radical because it happened in architecture. And what's possibly even stranger is that this conceptual act did not really generate any heightened form of self-awareness or in-depth discussions on medium specificity in this field. With only a few exceptions, we might even say that there hasn't really been a full-blown conceptual moment in architecture. Would like to offer another thought on this relationship of conceptual form to history that could now be understood as a post-conceptual act. As we see in Eisenman's notes, it is only fitting that conceptual forms are also always necessarily merely blank forms, as they present a position of extreme self-awareness. The function of a blank form is to identify the general format that could be filled in by specific content. And to give you a visual, or what I mean by blank forms in general, I include here the blank form for documenting the fingerprints of an applicant and another blank form for certifying a death of a person. Eisenman's erasure was like taking the specific information out of a form and rendering it blank, and therefore as close as architecture would get to a concept. By contrast, we see our project as the action of filling out forms much like these. As we fill out blank forms, we feel like we're certifying or making things certain, specifying the generalities, or simply writing. Roland Barthes argued for the writerly over the readerly, restoring each text not to its individuality, but to its function, subjecting it from the outset to a basic typology. The writerly text is written by writers for other writers. It is a structuralist text based on forms of reference and self-conscious relationship to history. This is the general form of writing, the first conceptual position. But the practice of writing also leads to a post-conceptual position. It is the active act of filling out formats. That is, to develop a writerly project in architecture, we work on specifying the materials, the sizes, the programs of blank forms, and this is what I will call the builderly. So with that, I'd like to show 3 projects, and they all deal with the idea of building. The first one is based on this ready-made by Marcel Duchamp. It's the Shotgun House in Lexington, Kentucky. The second one is the Paranormal Panorama, an exhibition that we built for the film by Constance Room and Christina Lang called Rehearsal here at the Max Center for Art and Architecture. And I'll end with the exhibition that Matthew mentioned that was just on display at SCI-Arc in spring of 2020 called Root Forms Among Us. So they all set up a building practice that would somehow carry certain kind of ideas that we developed at First Office through models and through kind of internal disciplinary projects back out into the field of construction, into the kind of logic of architecture in the expanded field. Okay, so if we take this as the first blank, then it is quite obvious, I guess, what I'm talking about, because this is a ready-made put together by a carpenter for Marcel Duchamp. But one thing that we know about it is that it opens one room while closing another. In other words, it fits two different frames of door. But because it was not really designed by an architect, we thought that some details were missing, as in some of the framing or some of the molding could be designed to be more continuous. So we basically thought about this door intersecting with the vernacular construction and structure and details and ornaments of a typical shotgun house in the kind of American South. The shotgun house is a kind of enfilade plan, I guess. There are 4 rooms usually that move from one to the next without any hallways. Here you see, you know, we kind of simplified it even further. So it's another blank, but it comes with a bunch of its own kind of specifications in terms of how it's built. And so what you see in the proposed plan is the introduction of the Duchamp door, of that kind of ready-made, and it's introduced multiple times. In fact, 5 double doors that produce a kind of rib or a longitudinal wall through the house, splitting those singular rooms into kind of doubled spaces, so that there is a hallway developed next to the main room. The idea behind the project, or I guess the prompt, by the arts collaborative in Lexington, was to produce a kind of rehabilitation of the shotgun house for an artist who would be working, living, and exhibiting their work in this one environment. And so the thought was to produce this double door as a way to allow for the house to become either public or private. So in the private sense, the plan 1, the doors would close in the transverse direction, and in the public space, when the galleries are open, we produce a kind of open house effect when the doors are turned in the other direction. So here is a kind of moment of zooming in on that plan. What we found kind of fascinating was the fact that the door had to abide by certain rules of construction, which is to say that once we added all the 2x4s and all the kind of lumber and molding to the project, we recognized the fact that these walls that had been drawn initially as kind of continuous single line weight segments had to produce a new kind of hiccup in the system to allow for that structural element of framing to actually become present in the project. And so what happened was that a house that was equally divided into 4 parts all of a sudden produced certain kinds of internal hierarchies, formal moments where one room could actually be squeezed to be almost an entire foot smaller in its length than the next. This is a kind of section through that same project. But what was especially interesting for us was a kind of shift in our understanding of where we could actually begin to add our own interest in thinking through detail. And it really had to do with the specification of molding and of thinking through some of the decorative effects of this vernacular building type. So that when the wall had to hiccup through the transverse wall, the molding also had to bend. And so in some cases, the framing had to turn the corner, and in others, it actually produced a little pleat for the door. Probably this model shows it a little bit better. It's a 1 inch equals a foot model. So all of the parts come from a kind of train set. But when that became an actual project built at full scale, there were a couple of other things that had to shift that we hadn't accounted for. So whereas in the model, there is a hidden magnet that allows the door to open and close to produce that feeling of, you know, enclosure, let's say, like that kind of pulls on the door in the model to actually allow it to enclose fully. In kind of real life, let's say, when it was being built, one thing that we recognized was that we would need to insert an additional door stop so that the door wouldn't get pulled off its hinges. And so you can see here that in one wall, the 2x4s are sufficient to produce the thickness of the wall, but in another, in order to add the little door stopper, we had to actually expand the wall to 2x6 piece of lumber. And so it produced an additional kind of thickness to that wall. And I'm not sure if you can see it in these pictures, but I'll go to the next and you'll be able to see it here, where the wall actually has to turn the corner twice in order to accommodate that door stop. So this is a shot of that door built in Chicago. We lost the competition in Kentucky, so the house was refurbished by another architect, but we were able to at least build the double doors for the Art Expo in 2015. The second project also features a door, but it's not so much about doors. It is another kind of blank space. And I have to say that talking about it as though we're filling out blank forms isn't something that happened at the very beginning of our practice. We just kind of worked on stuff. And then most recently, we realized that that was almost like a category or a kind of theme that ran through the work. So perhaps it's a way to summarize some of these ideas. But we're looking at a photograph of the interior of Viollet-le-Duc's cabinet at La Vedette. It was his house at the end of his life that that was built, or that he lived in, and he kind of built out in the Swiss Alps, outside of Lausanne. And I was just fascinated by this image. So when we found it, we were kind of struck by it. Kind of reminded a little bit of another one, but I want to move to the text that I think was important to me at the time. And we were looking at mountains in general, like what does it mean to be kind of painting a mountain, I guess, in the Swiss Alps for Viollet-le-Duc, and what other kinds of things are out there. Thomas Mann describes this amazing moment when Hans Kastorp leaves the kind of like sanitarium in a similar region of the Alps and walks through a snowstorm. Hosts of snowflakes flew against his eyelids so that he winked, overflowed his eyes, and made seeing as difficult as it was now impossible for other reasons, namely the dazzling effect of all that whiteness and the veiling of his field of vision, so that his sense of sight was almost put out of action. It was nothingness, white-whirling nothingness, into which he looked when he forced himself to do so. So to come back to the Caspar David Friedrich image, I kind of see it a little bit like this. Like any one of us can kind of take over the body of the wanderer above the sea of fog, but what he's looking at is a kind of landscape that's very difficult to see. What does it mean to lose your sense of vision? Quite clearly, to understand blankness in its highest resolution. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I guess we were talking about it back when we were looking at this project. And in particular, we were supposed to kind of build out a space inside of a gallery. The Mackie is a space that's like a white box that sits on top of the Schindler garage top here in LA. And it's really quite blank. I mean, there's a kitchen in the back, but for the most part, it's just a white gallery with a big glass wall that opens all the way. So it's a little bit daunting, I guess, for an architect to put something in there. We always talked about the fact that we want to work on backgrounds rather than foregrounds. We don't want to put installations inside of galleries. We want to put architecture and be hired more as architects, as service providers rather than exhibitors. And so we wanted to understand what it meant to build out a kind of blank white gallery and to bring our attention to forms of these like forms of white paint that we use kind of everywhere inside of the modern gallery. Kind of wanted to put pressure on that idea of neutrality. And so somehow the work of Viollet-le-Duc in relationship to an interior, which is to say how forms of landscape, especially with all that kind of dizzying blankness, actually enters very small room, became kind of important. But just to kind of give you a little bit of background, Viollet-le-Duc was a strange kind of architect. I mean, he looked at mountains and he thought of them as ruins of crystalline, perfect shapes. And so he wanted to think of the alpine landscape as something that he could kind of engineer back into some sort of ideal state. But because he was such an aficionado, I guess, of mountains and walking in them, he was asked by the French government to go into the Alps and to measure them. And so what he was doing is spending 8 summers at the end of his life, walking through the Alps and documenting the landscape, sometimes even falling nearly to his death in one of the kind of crevasses of the glaciers. He did so with an instrument, and we found this quite fascinating. He wrote about it extensively. He looked at the mountains through the camera lucida because he couldn't see them. He couldn't photograph them either because there was fog and snow everywhere. So something that couldn't be captured neither by technology nor by his eye, he was able to kind of understand and triangulate through the camera lucida, which is basically a small glass prism that allows for an image to bounce off its angles and not project physically, but in a way, if you're looking through that prism, you can, in a sense, see that image and trace its outline on a piece of paper. So that your idea of distance would come from numerous drawings that triangulated some of the peaks that you'd be looking at. So this kind of image allowed Viollet to produce panoramic renderings of the landscape surrounding him. And some of them were really kind of exquisite because, of course, the instrument only allows you to produce measurable peaks. But he went in and rendered the effects of kind of materiality and shadow as he worked out these images. One thing to bring your attention to is the fact that, you know, this is Mont Blanc, it's a nice mountain, but also that as we look at his panoramas, they all have stitches and lines of stitching that connect multiple perspectives together into one continuous landscape. And that's something that became quite important in the translation of the image of the mountain back into the space of his living room, of his cabinet. And so with this kind of unrolled elevation, we can actually see how the instrument works, which is to say that we can only capture one point perspectives at a time, but by recording multiple points of view, those things can get stitched together. So you can see that in the kind of distance, the mountain range produces one continuous panorama, but in the foreground, things begin to kind of get stitched a little bit more roughly, so that these lines are actual lines of kind of looking at the mountain from multiple, through multiple perspectival points. I mean, it's a kind of slit scan, if for those of you who are, working with contemporary technology, slit scan made with three frames instead of one pixel per, 1 pixel at a time. The 3 blanks, and this is where it gets kind of interesting for me, they come from the overlay of the interior of the cabinet against the panoramic image of the mountain. So what we're seeing are 2 doors kind of cutting out or redacting the image, and then also a kind of profile of the fireplace redacting the image on the right. So each one of the shots has also an object of an architectural scale sitting in front of it. And so what he was really trying to do is coordinate the scalar shifts and the kind of ways of overlapping these two very diverse kind of functions of the exterior with the interior. And some things that you'll notice are, for example, mountain peaks that are lined up with doors, and also the kind of foreground that actually like turns into the actual ground in the room. Looking closer a bit, the stitch between each frame becomes like a kind of a connector of the architectural interior, such that there's certain kinds of ways in which this room is clad that becomes an explicit kind of projection of that technological image against the scale of the architectural interior, so that the chair rail produces also an edge to the picture, but allows then for the stone in the image to jump out into the space of the room as very thin stone veneer. Or here, the stitch between two images that hadn't actually been, I mean, he could have painted it, I guess, to just kind of fuse the foreground into something more continuous, but instead a pilaster begins to kind of separate those things out. So there, as a result, there's a kind of continuity of the projection of the thing in the field, the landscape at a certain scale, against the interior kind of motifs and sizes and details, which we found super fascinating. So basically, looking at this particular case study, I wanted to understand what it might be to bring it into the gallery. And an important factor was also that we were working with Christina Lang and Constanze Rum, and their film was kind of staged also in the alpine landscape, where a character actually falls to her death in one of the scenes on a glacier as she kind of slides down on the ice. So somehow this idea of kind of bringing these characters together through different stories was quite important. This is a shot from across the street, looking back at the gallery. And what you see is the project kind of building out the interior of that space. And hopefully on your screens, you can actually kind of begin to adjust your eyes and also see a faint painted rendering on the interior of this continuous wall that shifts similarly to the way in which the kind of developed painting of the mountain shifted in Violet's room. There were kind of like added walls. So of course, like the space is added, but also little connections were added to the existing walls. This is a new door that we added as well. And we kind of joked about it, that we produced a little apartment out of a blank gallery, because all it had really was the wall separating the kitchen and the bathroom from the rest of the space. But we added a hallway and a bedroom and a kind of entryway with a living room. This is that glass wall that opens all the way to kind of block out the kitchen. And so the slit scan below, in a way, brings a contemporary lens to the technology that Violet was using with his camera lucida, and that it kind of projects that image of the panorama of the mountain that's featured in the film, and basically translates it onto the surface of the wall. This is that gallery from, again, just in context. We were super fascinated at the time to continue to work with these kind of like miniature models, kind of ridiculous scale. But this one in particular hinged out all the way to kind of allow for the drawing to flatten, and then hinged back into the shape of the actual floor plan. One thing that became important was the way in which we might begin to compare what it means to basically like produce a relationship between a model and a rendering. And this is research that Andrew was working on quite extensively at the time, kind of became somewhat obsessed with the Cornell Box kind of 1984 relationship of trying to build an algorithm to look like the model, and then building the model to actually look like the algorithm. There was a kind of back and forth that he describes in some of his work in that book, Not Interesting, that he published, where we couldn't actually look directly at any of the setups of the computer screen against the model, but the subject had to look at pictures that were taken to begin to produce that comparison. And we're kind of obsessed with thinking about what would it mean to bring renderings into the space of architecture. What would it mean to specify the conditions, the materials, and the ways in which we begin to kind of address the distinctions that are possible in digital space and kind of physical form. So looking at these two images and comparing them produced an important kind of understanding of the idea of painting walls in relationship to rendering surfaces, thinking about shade and shadow and layers of material, and the kind of depth that was possible in the simple application of paint. I mean, it's obvious that I'm kind of like talking about things like this, where two different hues of paint in Malevich's white on white produced a sense of depth in the flat plane of painting. And we're hoping to achieve a similar effect, and to say that if this painting is a proto-rendering, what would rendering be as a kind of proto-building? In many ways, we had to do this through the act of specification. And this is something that became super important, because in specifying something, we thought that we were actually filling out something blank. So in other words, all of that work to understand the labor of an architect could actually be summarized with many of these drawing types. And, you know, coming back to like somebody like Duchamp, he's always in the background, I guess, or his work at least, or Rose Salavi's work. But basically, the you know, when they say that there is a kind of specification of a tube of paint as something that is already an act of painting, that was actually quite important to us. So here we kind of begin to specify the details and thinking about ways in which certain paints can actually translate effects of rendering onto the material of the wall. What was kind of important was that we used paints that were basic, which is to say they were just the base paints of all the different brands, like Beryl Ultra Pure White Self-Priming Interior Flat, Valspar Ultra White Matte Interior, Dunn Edwards White Interior Flat Paint, Glidden White Interior Premium Plain Flat, Sherwin-Williams Extra White HGTV Home Interior Flat. We realized that the production of each one of these paints had its own kind of specific, almost like set of concerns or constraints, whether they were within the factories or the patents or the kind of materials used. So they produced, of course, slightly different hues and sheens within those base paints. So we could actually begin to produce distinctions. This is what this looks like. Kind of at first office construction site usually looks pretty low tech. It's just a computer screen projected back onto the wall, and then the painting kind of takes place. There were other things that were added, of course, like molding, like conduit, even certain air vents that weren't venting really anything at all, but only to produce the sense of a kind of domestic scale and the production of a foreground and a background within that wall. This was the opening kind of viewing of the film. I want to show one more project. I hope that there's still some time, but I'll show it briefly. And this is the one that we've been working on for the last 5 years, which has to do with a close study of megalithic forms. These are called dolmens. And in particular, we've been looking at photography by Eugène Trutat, who documented some of these dolmens outside of Toulouse at the end of the 19th century, or between 1870 and 1890. They're pretty amazing monuments. They are from 4000 BC, which is to say they're 6,000-year-old monuments. These photographs are 150 years old, and we're now interested in them in 2020, like in the last 5 years. So there's a kind of collapse of time that we were kind of curious about in relationship to some of these things. But before I kind of jump ahead of myself, one thing to note is that in the pictures of Eugène Trutat, he always takes these photographs straight on, kind of en face and in profile, so that he produces almost like portraits of some of these images. And quite often there are people hovering a lot around them, but they're not quite sure what to do because these things are like too small to be inhabited and kind of too large to be made sense of. And nobody really knows exactly why they came into being, but they're everywhere. And it's been an important aspect of studying these megalithic stone monuments. The fact that they are not local to any one continent or any one culture, or any one history, and they exist in India and Xi'an and France and Wales and Sicily and even North America. And so they produce a kind of globalism of a kind of first architecture that's populating our kind of prehistoric landscape. What was kind of hilarious to us was that the same photographer, Eugène Treatise, took photographs of things like this. So you see the image below of people also awkwardly sitting on top of some car from 1895. And so the kind of technology almost of the future was brought into the same landscape and documented with the same lens as the kind of technology of prehistory, which again, you know, to my eye was an important kind of juxtaposition. No doubt, I was so excited to be able to bring it in relationship with Le Corbusier's juxtaposition of certain kinds of monuments with other sorts of technologies. This brings to the kind of idea of maybe a new blank form. And of course, with Le Corbusier's domino, there is already one example in a kind of canonical historical context. So the question of the dolmen became a kind of maybe rewrite or kind of parallel projection of another form of blankness into our discipline, just to say that, you know, perhaps the modern objects that came out of a kind of structural idea could now be not replaced, but maybe kind of updated with a non-modern, a prehistoric object that's also based on some structural idea, but certainly a little bit less functionalist. Both for sure have certain kinds of columns holding up floor plates. Those floor plates extrude past their columns. There's a kind of openness to these systems. They do appear to be similar. And then I guess the second question was what kind of not structure, but structuralism, I guess, could be brought out of this. And I have to say that it's important, again, that it's not a kind of structuralism that can be brought back to one author. It's a structuralism that appears to be a little bit less explicit or certain of itself. There's a kind of inability to basically produce a clear syntax or a clear part-to-whole relationship. There are a bunch of parts, there are a bunch of wholes, there are a bunch of specimens, but none of them produce a kind of singular vision or a singular language that we can say is kind of specific or authored or ought to be copied. And so here you see that kind of production on the right-hand side of dolmen types and a kind of documentation of where we found them in the world. They're all kind of drawn or built in a similar way where some of their details begin to disappear, but their awkwardness and posture maybe come to the foreground. And of course, as the kind of texture of stone gets kind of erased because, you know, these things are just made out of paper, it gets replaced with a kind of stone texture that's just pure rendering rather than the kind of material itself, I guess I would say. And so this one was the project for PS1, which we rendered with a bunch of nails and some kind of paint on wood. But the nails kind of rusticated the edges of all of the boxes. So you can see that noise all around it that would have been just produced with a nail gun. In LA, we built a version of this with screws and two different paints that ranged that kind of had slightly different sheen, so that you can see that they at moments appeared to be the same, and at other moments they reflected light slightly differently. And then for the exhibition, the thought was to really bring together the research of photography and with the kind of production of an idea of a house. So these are the hands of Frederick Gallard, and she's holding here a negative print that was produced by Treatise in 1890. And in the other photo, it's a glass plate with silver oxide emulsion on it. Basically shows these portraits. And in fact, he wrote on the back in profile and on face to kind of give us a sense of the portraits of landscapes that he was working with. This is that print closer up. The thought was to just simply bring it into the gallery and see what would happen if we built it out as a house. You can see the plan stuffed into the space of the gallery. It's a terrible house plan, but you know, terrible only because it is shrunken. And one thing that was, maybe I'll show, yes, I have it here. The original plan was a 2-bedroom house that was designed for a site in Virginia, but hasn't yet been built. So imagine this kind of house shrinking into the space of the SCI-Arc gallery, and what remains of it is basically the project. The reason why in the introduction I kind of talked a little bit about moving back into the field was that working within galleries, on the one hand, you know, I showed 3 projects today. I'm showing them, I'm showing 3 projects today. One of them was exhibited in the kind of art expo in Chicago, another one at the Mack Center Gallery, the third at SCI-Arc Gallery. These are all projects that take ideas from landscape and from the kind of profession of architecture and architectural building, kind of shrink those interests into the spaces of galleries. And I want to read this diagram by Rosalind Krauss a bit in reverse, because she talks, of course, here, it's like late 1970s, describing sculpture in an expanded field, which is to say that it was a moment for sculpture to really break out of the gallery and to see itself in relationship to architecture, landscape, and construction at a kind of full scale. I think that as architects working in galleries, many of us perhaps must recognize that we're working now in a shrunken field of architecture rather than the expanded field of sculpture. So imagine this diagram collapsing in on itself and pushing certain kind of modes of production into very limited spaces and limited budgets and limited timeframes. And that's, I think that's how you get some of the work of First Office. The hope is to kind of bring it back out. But it also, you know, brings our attention perhaps that the reason why Treatise was interested in these things is that he was the director of Natural History Museum. And so you see Frederick working in Toulouse with the giraffe in the background, and her husband is the taxidermist at the museum. So there's a kind of perhaps less negative kind of, well, I don't know if it's less negative, but there is a kind of interest here, of course, with the idea of kind of collecting knowledge and putting it into a kind of accessible space. So root forms among us, I'll end with some photographs of just us, you know, getting the photographs ready and working out the details of SIP material. This is a structural insulated panel, which is a sandwich of OSB plywood and EPS foam that basically builds up through the kind of laying out of these sill plates, drilling them into the concrete floor, and then kind of landing these walls on top. These are some of my friends, Austin Anderson, master builder, Ben Weisgold, selecting colors that would match the concrete floor. Reza there in the background. I'd like to try to make this work. So let's see. It says 3D content is disabled. Let's try one more time. So here we're laying out the tape and just setting things up for the sill plates. to be leveled. Something that was important that we realized was that this joint, the kind of contraction joint in the concrete floor, was the only 1990 coordinate system that we could use to actually base the entire project off. Then the walls come in, these things just almost magically begin to populate the space. Another sill plate is added. There's splines between these that actually bind the entire wall together, and then the roof comes in. This is like day 3, I think. Finally, we're all sitting on top of this thing. This is Rob Sipchin. He's now working at First Office still. And we're kind of taking a break, just like, I guess, our friends in the treetop photograph were sitting on their dolmen. So this is what it looked like side by side. There is a kind of photography part of the show where we printed with a carbon printer, kind of pietzographic process, from the silver oxide kind of glass negatives, the photographs that hadn't actually yet been published. And then we also brought in the pedestal inside of the dolmen kind of house, the original negatives that came from the museum. Maybe it's important to mention, like, and here Joshua White, he's a little bit like rough with his color toning, but the wall was pinkish, certainly not pink, but importantly so because the dolmen was greenish, certainly not this green. This is kind of overly saturated. But the sense of the space was actually quite neutral. So we worked quite a bit to understand how to render this environment in a way that brought kind of sense of texture and color, producing a kind of feeling of stone without using the actual stone material. And then also thinking about that gray paint of the kind of, not asphalt, but the concrete extending to the edge of the gallery and moving up the wall of that kind of wainscoting. So if you remember the stone cladding of wainscoting in the Violet space, maybe something much simpler but similar here happening with that paint extending up the wall to produce a kind of horizon line. I'll end with a couple of photographs of the interior, and then of course the photographs, or the photograph of the photographs. So I'd like to thank you. I know that we have Q&A as well. I hope we have time, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Yeah, we do have time. Anna, that was really great. Thank you so much for that. Really fascinating projects. And yeah, let's jump into Q&A. So we have a question. So for all of you watching, thank you so much for being here. And please, any question you have, type it into the Q&A box, and we will try, or Anna will try to address them. So we have a first question here from Percival. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, Percival. I'll just read the question out. Super inspiring talk, thank you. Is this practice of finding things in the archives, so to speak, and collaging them together with your own ideas an intentional method, or just an organic product of your work and research?
Well, it's a good question. It's true that it's present in the work. And I think that intentional and organic are maybe somehow similar. I don't see them as opposites. I mean, in some ways, we don't go into archives to look for things. We just work on stuff. And I do think that it helps to be part of the kind of part of the educational, I guess, environment, because as teachers, both Andrew at Berkeley and myself at SCI-Arc, we're constantly thinking about the kind of history to technology, or the context to the way in which we work. And so many of these kind of references, they happen through teaching, and they happen through conversations with students. So I think it's very hard for me to parse the professional work and professional interests from educational or pedagogical interests. And so I would say that it's both organic and intentional. If that helps to answer the question, I would like to confuse those two terms, I guess, one with the other.
Anna, I have a question. I mean, one of the things I find really interesting about your projects is I mean, things like moldings, vents. I mean, the first project, the Duchamp doors. I mean, there was a kind of a moment where it became really specific about certain really relatively fine details and kind of molding how to make the door work. Um, and then, of course, in the second project, the Viollet-le-Duc kind of inspired work or referenced work. The vents, the conduits were so important. And it strikes me that there's a kind of thread in the project, which is almost these kind of quotidian, everyday elements that become so important, but they're coupled with this real, maybe, I don't know, an interest, sometimes overt, sometimes less overt, with the sublime almost. Yeah? And is that a fair characterization, that there's this sort of tension and ongoing interest in this sort of presence of something both sublime, sometimes literally, like with the mountainscape and the sort of whiteness, and then right there, like we must have a conduit coming down to kind of bring it into a different, I don't know, can you talk about that?
Yeah, I like your question so much. It's like so beautifully put. I think that we often talk about it as if the architectural scale is missing, like as if the diagram gets built out with all of this junk that normally gets like photoshopped out of images. When Joshua White was taking photographs of the gallery that Andrew had put together, he also did a show there about maybe 7 years ago. He asked Andrew whether or not he should Photoshop out, all of the vents and plugs that most people ask him to get rid of. And Andrew said, no, in fact, they're part of the show.
yeah. We put them there.
Some of them were made out of paper to look like they were vents, but they're just built as models. So it's true. Like, I think in many ways it brings our attention to the fact that architecture is quite mundane, or at least the parts of architecture. And also maybe it allows us to not put so much formalism into, or kind of formatting into forms. Like there are not that many forms in our work, but there is a lot of small scale decisions. And I think that's why we lean on the word specification, and we lean on the word kind of filling out or specifying blankness, because there is, in that sense, a kind of large scale emptiness and a small scale resoluteness.
It strikes me, and we'll get to Arnold, your question. Thank you so much for putting it there. Anyone else has some questions, we'll try to get to them all. But it's interesting you began the talk kind of referencing your desire to kind of shift how the practice has been working out of the exhibition into the service industry, or aspect of architecture, and do things for clients on sites. And it's really interesting that, to me, it seems like a strong strain in your work inside the gallery like prepares you well for the kind of, in the kind of constraints of specific existing buildings and client desires and code and all of this, that where so often one is fighting against the things you want to Photoshop out, but here you've already prepared yourself to embrace them so thoroughly.
Yes, it's funny. I agree with you. And I think we use the word practice, like we're practicing to be architects. Somebody says, I'm a practicing architect, and we say, no, we've been practicing to become one, but yeah.
It's really fascinating. Okay, Arnold, I'm just going to read the question out. Thank you for the very interesting lecture. I was wondering about your thoughts on materiality. Particularly, I find it interesting how your take on the dolmen as form contrasts with Vanderland's take on the dolmen as initially material extraction, architecture as a reorganization of matter. Would you say materiality works in the service of form, in the service of your work?
Okay, I have to read it one more time because there's a lot here. I don't know Vanderland's take of the dolmen as a material extraction. What does that mean? Arnold, can you jump into the screen or send another text? But I can start with the final question before you kind of interpolate that. Would you say materiality works in the service of form? Um, I, I do think that we're kind of material forward, I guess. But it's not, it's kind of like, I mean, there isn't, I'd say it's like material plus format is maybe more closer than the idea of something like form. I'm not sure how much form there is in this. I'm saying this a little bit self-consciously because we came and started the practice in LA in 2010-11, and I think LA takes its forms and formalisms very seriously, as probably many of you know. And I think that our resistance to kind of enter that discussion is probably what allowed us to expand on some of these ideas that are not really coming out of this landscape. They're a little bit kind of contrarian, I guess. We've been told we're contrarian within our context here in regards to our like kind of previous generations. So I would, yeah, I don't know. I think material and format is probably closer.
So
I
Arnold's,
see, Arnold.
yeah, he added a little bit. Thank you for adding, Arnold.
Thinking how materiality was lost in the translation of the dolmen in your own work. Right. I mean, there's no stone there, right? But I think that there's no stone, but there's the quality of stone. So I guess what we've done is we've translated quite often an exhumed, let's say, qualities from materials through the technology of rendering, and then reapplied them through material practice, which is to say, we don't have to make the dolmen out of stones because we're not in the Stone Age anymore, but we'll make them out of sips because that's a contemporary material that is appropriate for making a house. However, when painting it, we had to dilute a very glossy dark green paint with quite a bit of water and then apply it with a paint gun in such a way that both the texture of the OSB and the sheen of the paint could be visible so that it would photograph as though it were stone. So in other words, there's a kind of qualitative, I guess, translation rather than an honesty to materials. But I'll have to look up Vanderland's take on the dolmen. It's fascinating.
All right. It's 7:03. Oh, do we have Arnold saying haha, thank you. Please, if anyone else has any questions, we'll take one more. Well, just maybe as the last one then, if I mean, how have you, I'm just curious how you have found your so to speak ready-mades. I mean, do you know what I mean? Like to go from, like, were they just, you're just following your intuitive desires and curiosities in the world, you know, like to discover these dolmens and get into them, the sort of amazing Magic Mountain interiors of Viollet-le-Duc, and then the specificity of the shotgun house. I mean, it's a kind of, I mean, there's clearly some strong ongoing threads, but it's really interesting how different elements get pulled into the work.
Yeah, no, you're right, and I'm probably not telling the full story because I'm kind of pulling out very particular references. They seem neatly kind of put together into some sort of coherent collection of things. They're certainly from a very particular part of the woods, you know, it's like neck of the woods or whatever that expression is. They're actually quite limited in scope. I mean, like most of the things I showed were French, probably. But the thing that probably Andrew would say is that we have hundreds of references for different things, and we're looking and reading a lot of competing and things that are actually not so nearly aligned as I have shown. And so when he talks about our work, he puts it into a much more, he uses words like confusing and, overlapping and contradictory, and talks about a kind of multiplicity of reference and multiplicity of interests that align and sometimes they misalign. So I think that what I have to say is I've edited the content in such a way as to give you a clarity of thinking that wasn't there with any of the projects. Like, as we're working on them in the office, we developed the plan of the shotgun house without the reference to Duchamp's door. That's something that came halfway through the competition.
Oh, interesting. Right. Mm-hmm.
And once it came into the picture, it clarified the idea of the enfilade plan that we were working with. And now we don't even tell the story without it being a kind of principal element. But a lot of things don't click into place until we can maybe set them within a kind of cultural context. And that's something that's been super important, which is to say, we really do see ourselves as architects, as professionals, as service providers. We also see ourselves within a field of a kind of intellectual production that isn't limited to our field, but is really the production of like humanity. Like, we're interested in technology and in writing and in image making and in painting and in ink cartridges and all kinds of things. And we just try to, that's kind of like what we do as human beings anyways. So I think that's why all of these things are populated with reference.
Yeah. I think that's really beautiful. That's really beautiful. And I find, the shotgun home, I love this enfilade of doors. It's such a wonderful project. It's great. Okay, it's 7:07. I think we should we wrap it up? Let's wrap it up.
Of course, okay. Let's wrap it up. It was wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's amazing to be in British Columbia. I wish I was there in person. I just was looking forward so much to actually flying out last semester.
Have you been to BC before, Anna?
No, I haven't. I would absolutely love to come up.
Yeah, well, when the pandemic shifts and hopefully ends, we'll invite you up in person. We have lots of great mountains up here, obviously. So and amazing. Great rock formations and lots of drywall and conduit. We have it all.
I'm sure I'll find a dolmen out there too.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. So I guess Emma's in the background and in charge of when things officially start or stop. But I guess, Emma, we're all done. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you for those who asked questions. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.